everybody at home. Welcome to Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits. I have my cup of tea and my my biscuit up already, and we are about to embark on another episode. This time we're going to be talking about black propaganda. Do subscribe if you haven't already. At any time you can also leave questions in the chat, and I will try and ask our new guest as many as I can. As always, I'm extremely grateful to those of you who are supporting my show on Patreon. I'll be sending out a new update on my work very shortly this week as well, so if you haven't subscribed, please do. Today on the show, I'm really delighted to welcome Rory Cormac, a professor and historian from the United Kingdom. Rory focuses on intelligence, and he's based at University of Nottingham. Rory, it's so good of you to join us, and I'm a real fan of your work, so I'm really just so fangirl here.
Very kind. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. First of all, I've got my cup of tea. I know that you're being sneaky, and you didn't get a cup of tea, so we're gonna have to fake it.
I'm sorry, I left it too late. I didn't want to keep the audience waiting while my kettle boils. So here's to a glass of water.
Oh dear, oh dear. So I wanted to talk to you mostly because of the amazing work that you've been doing this year. It really has been fantastic. You've got a new book out and a new article on probably one of the most difficult subjects to study in this area, really, the black, the covert and sneaky. So I want to get into that, in great depth very shortly. And first of all, I was hoping you could just sort of define what is this black propaganda? And your main subject is obviously sort of intelligence studies and covert action. And so people may, as this show is more about propaganda, may not quite understand exactly what that is and where this concept of black propaganda might sit within it. So do you mind sort of introducing these ideas and the terms and the practices to us a little?
Of course. Well, you're the expert in propaganda. I just dabble. I'm a generalist. I'm interested in covert action broadly defined. So we have propaganda down one end, and of course the covert unattributable propaganda is what I'm interested in, rather than the public messaging and what we might call white propaganda. And then it spans down through to through electoral interference, coups, covert political action, going through further down to sabotage and cyber sabotage and covertly arming rebel groups, secret wars, all the way up to the most controversial form of covert state activity of assassinations and targeted killings. So propaganda is one aspect of that. Although it's worth noting that in the world of covert action, propaganda and influence operations is by far the most prevalent. Often in the media we obsess about the James Bond type things that go bang in the night because they're the most visible, they're the most dramatic, when actually the vast majority of state-sponsored covert operations are in the influence world rather than in the assassination or secret warfare world. So it's an incredibly important topic. But my interest in it comes from the secret side. So when I'm interested in grey and black propaganda, it's the material where the source is concealed. So there's an element of deceit. Now that might involve spreading truthful information, broadly defined, but it's the source which is misleading. And quite often governments know that their message will not be deemed particularly credible with a target audience if it's got US government, or I was going to say Her Majesty's government. It's no longer Her Majesty's government. His Majesty's government stamps all over the message. People will see that and think, oh, it's British communications, it's American communications, or we can ignore that. So the message becomes more credible when the source is disguised in some way. And grey propaganda is when that source is ambiguous, black propaganda is when you are actively framing, forging, deceiving, coming up with a fake group in order to deceive your audience and make that message as credible, unbelievable, and actionable as it can be. So I'm more interested in that kind of darker side of the spectrum.
Yes, the real dirty spectrum of propaganda and influence, isn't it? So one of the things that I think seems so interesting around your recent paper as well is the focus is on the UK. A lot of the time we hear about American covert action and American propaganda. Can you tell us a little bit about the focus of your article? It's on, I think, the Cold War, isn't it?
Yeah, it's in Cold War Studies, just come out this summer, and I focus on British history, largely because I am British and I can go to the archives, and I find it so fascinating because Britain does a lot of this stuff as well. And you're right, all of the 95% of the books on this are written by Americans on an American perspective, and understandably so. I mean, first of all, the US is much more open with its files than, say, Britain. The fact that I can sit here in my office and go on the CIA website, the CREST website, and look at digitized CIA documents, I mean, that is amazing. Whenever Americans moan about classifications, try coming to England. It's a different kettle of fish entirely. And but I think there's a danger by over relying on the American experience. We're missing what other states are doing, and other states do this, maybe to a lesser degree in terms of volume than say American Cold War operations, and particularly Soviet Cold War operations. But other states do this as well. And in the UK, the government declassified about 8,000 files in 2019, 2020 about Britain's Cold War propaganda unit, who were called the Information Research Department, based in the Foreign Office. We know they exist. Their files have been open since the 1990s. There's been two or three very good books on the IRD. Many of your viewers here will be familiar with them. But this huge tranche of files relates to a particular, they're called operational files, and they relate to a particular unit within them. And it's what the IRD were calling black productions, by which they meant forgeries and the creation of fake groups, basically, to spread British messages. And the article tells a story of these operations, these black operations, from the 1950s through until the 1970s, when the IRD closed. And there are at least 350 separate operations which I've had a look at, and they're global. There's no challenge of studying this stuff from a British perspective, which is the same as from an American perspective, to be fair, is that the Brits, in imperial power in an age of decline, had their fingers in a lot of pies all over the world. And so when you're trying to write about this, 1 minute you're writing about British manipulation of Brazilian newspapers, and then in the next paragraph you're talking about West African resistance movements. Next paragraph you're talking about Indonesian civil military relations. Next paragraph you're talking about Spanish Moroccan disputes over Spanish colonial territory. It gets quite it's quite a span. So it's a global story, and I argue in the piece, looking at these 350 operations, the British black productions existed on a much larger scale than historians realise, and that Britain was not just using this to expose Soviet lies, which is the standard narrative, but was also trying to sow confusion itself and to try and discredit and divide and polarize audiences. And even occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, sowing or inciting some sort of violence or even racial tensions and religious tensions occasionally. But that was quite rare. The other thing I argue is that this was genuinely truthful material, not generally rather truthful material, but it was spread using fake sources. And I find this distinction really quite interesting, which is the British diplomats doing this said they did not lie. Britain does not spread lies in this sense.
Liability.
And going through those files, there weren't many outright lies. Now, there are some examples in British history that they have done that, but generally speaking, they're not telling huge lies. But what they are doing is forging documents, supposedly from, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are creating fake groups, whether that is think tanks or whether that is fake West African liberation movements to spread this, which has an element of deceit in it. And you can see in the files, they won't accept that. They say, well, we're doing that for credibility purposes. We're not spreading lies. And I find that whole, and gets to some philosophical questions about what is truth and what is deceit and what is disinformation. They were having none of it, but I think it's slightly more problematic than they were letting on. I'll give you a quick example. One of them was a forgery of a Muslim Brotherhood leaflet. This was 1960s. They wanted to publicize the fact that the Egyptian president Nasser, who Britain hated for various reasons, had used chemical weapons in the Yemeni civil war. That was the claim. Britain was telling everyone, target audiences were saying, we don't believe you because you're Britain and you lie. So to get around that, they forged a Muslim Brotherhood document denouncing Nasser for using chemical weapons and in the process being a bad Muslim, essentially. They were disowning him. And Nasser did use chemical weapons. The content of the letter was generally true. But in order for it to be credible, it had to be written in a particularly aggressive language, because that was the tone of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. In order to be credible, it was inciting violence. It's quite anti-Semitic. It was talking about how much damage he could have done against Israel if Nasser had used it against Israel. Why is he using it against Muslims? Very unsavory stuff, which changes the meaning, it changes the content, it changes the nature of the document. So whilst the British diplomats were adamant that this was necessary to make it credible, and it was still true, so it's fine, but actually that source, the fake nature of the source, impacts upon the true nature of the content in a way which I think is really philosophically interesting about, does this constitute truth anymore?
Also, I mean, the British public, I would imagine they would consider this still to be quite a whopper. You know, we would still generally consider this to be, you know, a porky pie, I think. You know, I don't think most people would consider that to fly, that, you know, that this is supposedly truthful, you know. And so I think maybe it also says something to the definition of, well, what is truth? What is real? and what is acceptable to say, you know, well, we're still sort of saying the truth. At what point does it become actually really you're not for them in the popular sense?
I think it's an important point, because when we get to in the media and contemporary discourse, we that word disinformation is the go-to term time and time again, whether it's academics, commentators, journalists, politicians. We're always countering disinformation, and then we say, well, what is disinformation? And you know, the standard definitions again are deliberately deceiving audiences with inaccurate information, and the differentiation with misinformation, as you know, about, well, it's not intentional to deceive. So then the question, if that's the standard definition, that you are misleading, deliberately misleading with lies, where does the kind of thing that we're talking about fit into that? Because one of the things I develop a bit in the article, but also in a bit more detail in the book, is we need to, I'm interested in what you think of this. We need to differentiate between source and content when we're talking about truthfulness, because you can have a deceit, a fake source, and you can have truthful content. It's not, it's a bit simplistic at the moment, where we say, oh, that's a lie, or that's not a lie, or that's misinformation, that's disinformation. And also, well, I'm ranting about disinformation because it's a concept that bugs me. How can we prove that there's intent to deceive as well? When we say, oh, disinformation is intentional deceit, whereas misinformation is just making mistakes. How can we prove there's intent? How can we prove it's not true? What is true anyway? And then how do we differentiate between source and content? And I think once you start digging down a little bit, that whole disinformation thing becomes analytically problematic.
Well, having read some, not all of your book, I'll admit, but having read some of your book, I mean, it also made me think about like my own research, which looks at actors, and this problem of, you know, deliberate and intentional, and actually, you know, how do we figure that out? It's something that I'm looking at with my publications, and I think the kind of research that you do, it's archival, it's necessarily focused on the past, and that's why you're able to get the documents you are. You know, it enables you to look at actors in a way that actually in the contemporary world, it's much harder to do. And actually the work that you do does kind of get at that intentionality because of the access that you get. And I think also, if we look at, for instance, revelations like Cambridge Analytica, you know, what the internal, you know, discussions and whistleblower evidence and things like that, and you know, these kinds of insights enable you to see a little bit more the intentionality and the understand motives. Whereas a lot of the time, much of the research on disinformation focuses on the output, and you cannot tell from output what the intentions were of who was behind it, and that really causes a lot of problems. And you know, I think you make this point in your book about truth and facts. I don't know if you want to develop that a little further, because I thought the point you made about how the Soviet Union would have seen its propaganda was a really interesting one. This idea that they wouldn't have seen it the way that we would. Do you know what I'm trying to get at?
I do, and it comes back to this. It comes back to this point about, well, if we're gonna judge things on whether they are spreading truth or they're spreading lies, we need to be a bit more wary of what we mean by spreading truth. And there are actors that would say that they are making something, you know, they might be making something up, but it's to illustrate a broader truth. And yeah, we can disagree with that. We can say that's nonsense. But they wouldn't see it as lying. You know, if they're going to make something up to illustrate a point that NATO is an aggressor, is a bad guy, then that speaks to a broader truth. Because if they're going to make something up to highlight the inherent kind of imperialism of UK, US, the West, so where facts, it starts getting horribly postmodern, but you know, facts are constructed. I never, as an archive historian, I never thought I'd take this turn, and I kind of hate myself every day when I start talking about it. But if you know, history is contested, truth is contested, facts are constructed and assembled by people with biases and all that. So I think the point I'm trying to get at is we need to problematize a little bit the idea of you're telling truth, she's telling a lie. He's telling a lie, she's telling the truth. Because it's not that simple, and he or she's doing it deliberately. And your point about alphas and actors is a really good one. What do we do when that disinformation is being laundered through a useful idiot, through an unwitting third party? Are they doing disinformation? They don't realize they're doing it.
They are both victims and accountable actors, at the same time, who should be perhaps they at least have a responsibility to try to verify, potentially, if they have a level of power. So there may be more of a sliding scale on all of this than we are currently discussing it at. And one of the things that I'm talking about in my forthcoming paper, a book chapter, is actually this kind of idea that actually it should focus on coercion, and there are other aspects to the ethics that we're not really considering enough at the moment. It's not just about lies. It might well be like with the example that you discussed on, Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood. That's a wider ethical, problem than just about false and true. This is about incitement and racism and all sorts of different, consequences that might flow from an operation like that. And I think they're getting away with sort of claims that this is okay because it's, there's a credibility issue. Well, there might be a reason there's a credibility issue in some of these cases.
I think we tend to treat a lot of this stuff as in quite a narrow and binary manner, particularly from the historical perspective. When you say there's a spectrum, and that's almost become a motto through everything I've published in the last, a mantra. I think I've published in the last few years is, there's a spectrum of secrecy. We're not talking about secret versus overt. It drives me mad. This kind of this false binary. A state either does something openly or it does something secretly. I mean, it's a nonsense. There are multiple points in between, and secrecy is constructed of two things anyway: visibility and acknowledgement. There's a spectrum there. There's a spectrum of white propaganda, i.e., obvious owned source, all the way through to black propaganda. It's not either or. It's all about spectrums, and I don't think, particularly historians, I mean, people like you who study propaganda properly are doing great stuff. But I think the covert action literature historically generally has been a bit more simplistic and a bit more binary. It's more about, well, what did the CIA do, or what did MI6 do that was covert, and then did it work? And I think one of the other weaknesses of the literature is this focus on output, as you mentioned earlier, where we're judging success, and the diplomats were guilty of this, judging success by the numbers of hits that particular pieces got. So you do a black propaganda operation, you spread some information in, let's say, somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you literally count up the number of newspapers that picked up this leaflet. And in the British case, the IRD operations that we were discussing earlier, they had a hit rate of 10%. So only 10% of their operations ever got picked up. But that was how they judged success. Not about the outcome, not about what behavior was changed, which of course is very difficult to measure in the analog era. But there was no attempt to measure it. Even now. It was just, how many hits did we get? And again, it's treated kind of simplistically. And I think one of the things that people from propaganda studies, political communication studies, political scientists and some historians are starting to problematize that a little bit and break it down and think, well, what are we actually trying to do? How can we judge success in this area? And how does this fit in with wider communication, with wider foreign policy? And let's stop treating, and I'm guilty of this because I've literally just written an article all about the propaganda side of things, the covert side of things. But what we need to do as scholars is integrate that into the wider history. This propaganda, as you well know, exists to multiply other things, other open foreign policies and military strategies, tactics. It doesn't exist in isolation.
No.
And so often, a history of IRD, again, I'm guilty because I've just done one, is about the propaganda, not about the foreign policy that propaganda is trying to amplify or lay the groundwork for a particular diplomacy or sanctions or something. It needs to come out of that covert overt divide. And get that. It's false multiplication, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, I think with your paper as well, you shared there was a graph which also was shared on Twitter, which showed the kind of narratives that I think were, the kind of propaganda themes within these documents that you were looking at. And there was a big spike with nationalism. And it seemed very clear to me that this is kind of coming from, a colonialism, that Britain was still engaged in this kind of effort to, smear nationalist movements in former colonies and so on, and try to shape the outcome of these kinds of struggles at that time. Would you say that was part of it?
Well, first of all, that was the first graph I've ever done since I was about 14 at school, hanging out on Excel. I was very proud of myself doing that as an archival historian. This is me entering the world of modern political science. I'm so used. But yeah, there's one of the things that was really quite striking about these files is the interplay between Cold War and nationalism and end of empire. These aren't two separate things. They are very much intertwined. And a lot of these operations, the vast majority of these operations, were targeting the global south. And it's building on a whole load of history work that's gone on over the last decade or so, relocating much of the Cold War away from the back streets of Berlin and, trilby-wearing spies shuffling through Vienna towards global history. And it was a global Cold War. And what we see is in places like post-imperial Africa, there was a battle for influence after the Brits left, the Brits decolonized and the French decolonized. They're worrying then about Soviets encroaching in the post-imperial space. They're worrying about the Chinese encroaching in the post-imperial space. So you start to see Britain creating fake nationalist groups who are warning against neo-imperialism coming from Moscow. And to make it credible, are also criticizing British imperialism at the same time. So it's right. all very, very much wrapped up together. It's quite difficult to disentangle. The other example, which is slightly different though, was Spain. Now, I didn't know anything about this. My knowledge of Spanish history is pretty shaky, if I'm honest. But there's a whole campaign targeting Spanish colonialism in Morocco.
Wow.
And they were creating fake nationalist groups to try and push the Spanish out of Morocco, delivering fake petitions to the UN. And I'm thinking, well, why? And of course, it was to throw the Spanish off the scent of Gibraltar, because the Spanish were making noises about British imperialism in Gibraltar. And so the Brits are kind of throwing it back at Spain to try and cause some trouble around their territories in North Africa. And again, this nationalism, the rise of newly independent states in the United Nations who are having a bigger and bigger voice, and it's all wrapped up together in British decline, in Cold War, in end of empire, and these things feed into each other. And I think trying to separate Cold War from end of empire is difficult and quite futile.
Right. Well, we have one question, I think, from George Chiesa. So he's asking about how attributing the statements to entities that are essentially echo chambers is making people believe that a source that they trust has validated the statements, regardless of the statements themselves being true or false. And I think he's saying that is deliberately deceptive. So that seems to, I think, be what you're arguing as well, I think, here, certainly. And I was going to say also that I think one of the things that is interesting as well in your paper is actually that you discuss, or in the book rather, that you discuss how this deception can be anything. So it's not even just posts on Facebook or leaflets and magazines or in the news. It might even be little figures on your shelf back there. Or there are some rather more gruesome examples of deception, I think, that you highlighted in the book. There was one from the Philippines. Would you be able to tell us about that? That was quite shocking.
Yeah, on the first point about the source deceiving, there's an interesting example where the Brits created a fake West African resistance group called the Freedom for Africa movement, I think they were called. And they started every leaflet with their rallying cry of loyal African brothers, and then it went on this big diatribe. And I think that's particularly deceptive because creating a fake resistance movement does create that echo chamber, and it does give the reader succor that there are other people out there who are willing to rise up and fight. And I think that's particularly, that could potentially be particularly dangerous if you end up inciting resistance to regimes which are not kind to people doing resistance, on the false assumption that there is an entire resistance movement behind them, which only exists on paper. And I think that in itself is deceptive and has clear ethical problems. But you're right about the broader landscape here, because propaganda or influence isn't only about written word and tweets these days, or it's not about radio and TV. It's not about media, I suppose. And I was reading recently some British files, and they were talking about disinformation was the word they used back in the 1970s. Felt quite modern reading discussions of Soviet disinformation back in the 1970s. And they were saying that the Soviet definition of disinformation or desinformatia was the aim to create fake reality in the minds of the enemy in order to manipulate them into doing something advantageous for the Soviets. Now, crucially, that wasn't just propaganda, as we would say it, as we would see it today. It also included sabotage, for example, or other forms of kinetic activity. to have a psychological effect, because that's the
Wrap
key.
up now. I'm so sorry, cutting you off. It's such an important point as well. I really apologize, but I'm just seeing we have less than 1 minute to go on the
Oh, sorry.
Zoom. It's my fault. I was so engrossed. Thank you so much, Rory, for joining us. And everybody else can also have a look at your paper and your amazing book. Go buy it now and join us again in 2 weeks' time for Afternoon Tea and Truth Biscuits. Sorry, Rory.